Folks, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm going to talk, as I have for the last number of years, talk about what I call the three long-term foothills bird counts, and I call them that because they're all 30 plus years. But it's nice to see other counts in the area are getting up there in terms of their longevity. It's been mentioned already that long-term data sets are valuable, and I certainly agree with that. So the three counts I'm going to talk about are one called the Snake's Head, which is up in the Sundre area, Cochrane Wildlife Reserve, which is in the Water Valley area, and Sheep River, which is the Turner Valley, Millerville area. And let me just go to the next slide and give you some geographic idea on them. Many of you know this, but some probably don't. So the Snake's Head is the farthest north circle on this figure. Cochrane Wildlife Reserve is the next circle down, and Sheep River is this circle to the southwest of Calgary. All of the current circles that are being counted are not on this figure. It was made some years ago, and I believe these were the circles that were extant at that time. So the one thing to get from this figure is to keep in mind that Snake's Head or Sundre is the farthest north. Cochrane Wildlife Reserve is in the middle, and Sheep River is to the south. That has implications for the kind of birds in the habitat. This is the Audubon map of the Snake's Head or Sundre count circle. A whole bunch of detail on there, doesn't really matter. The important thing to get out of this figure is that the Red Deer River essentially bisects or almost bisects the circle, and it's a very important feature in the count circle. And the habitat in this circle is primarily dry mixed wood. So this is kind of the southern edge of the boreal forest, boreal mixed wood, but there is some lower foothills on the west side out here where it looks more forested. So this year we ended up with 32 species. It was a very cold day out there. It wasn't our lowest count, but it was on the low side for sure. This is the circle. This is the Audubon map of the circle for the Cochrane Wildlife Reserve, and it doesn't have any major drainages in it, other than maybe the little Red Deer River, which is in the northwest part. It's primarily lower foothills, but there is some foothills parkland on the east side of the circle and some upper foothills on the west edge. And Cochrane Wildlife Reserve this year counted 38 species, which was a good count, average the good count for Cochrane Wildlife Reserve. This is the circle for Sheep River, again from Audubon. This circle is primarily lower foothills habitat with some foothills parkland on the east side and a little bit of subalpine, essentially inaccessible, on the west side. And Sheep River this year tied the lowest count ever back in 1991, I think, or 92, of 30 species. Now, before I get to the actual count results, I always like to show the participants that helped us out on these counts. And many of you are familiar with this scheme where I highlight the folks who did all three counts or did at least two counts. This year, the star of the show was Jim St. Laurent, who did all three counts. He was the only one. And there were several of us that did two, and then a whole bunch of other folks who could only do one count. If anybody notices that their name isn't on this, let me know. Get a hold of me some other way and let me know so that I can add it before I distribute this. So to get to the results, and I'll just remind folks that that the counts, as I present this data, I present it from north to south, so from the Sundre area through Water Valley to Sheep River. And of course, everybody who knows our area around here knows that as you go farther south, you get closer to the mountains, and that influences the kind of birds and the numbers that we find. I've already mentioned the number of species that we had. You can see that from the participant point of view, Snake's Head had a very low number of participants this year. It wasn't a very nice day out there, although it wasn't windy. It was cold all day, but it wasn't windy. But Cochrane Wildlife Reserve had a cold day, bitterly cold, really. And but the count still went that day. Sheep River was initially scheduled for the 27th, but I changed it to the 2nd of January to try and take advantage of the forecast good weather. And we did get good temperatures on the 2nd, but it was pretty windy, particularly in the morning. And that had some effect, I believe, on the results. I just want to make a pitch at this point that I certainly understand that the Snake's Head count is a pretty, it was a long drive from Calgary and makes for a long day, but I'd just make this pitch to folks to try and find a way or consider participating in that count in future years. The long-term data sets that we're developing with these Christmas bird counts are invaluable, and every additional year is really important. So, we're seeing a decline in the number of participants over the peak years, particularly in the Snake's Head and Cochrane Wildlife Reserve counts. So, if you can find a way and have the inclination, we'd love to have you participate next year and in subsequent years. I know there's a lot of counts out there, and some of them are on the same day. So I appreciate that we have to deal with that. Okay, to get into the birds on these 3 counts. On this page, the only thing I really wanted to mention, other than just give you a few seconds to look at it and see the numbers for any species you're particularly interested in, but there were no rough-legged hawks at the Snake's Head count, which is pretty interesting considering that in 1987 the count at Snake's Head was 70, and in 1997 the count was 54. So quite a volatile species, at least in the Snake's Head area. Owls in all 3 of these counts were hard to come by this year, and owls are a group that has attracted people in the past to come out on these counts, just hopefully to see owls. But this year was a tough year, although there was a short-eared owl and a northern hawk owl at Snake's Head. So those were nice surprises. Our great horned owls continued to be low on all 3 of these counts. And I'm aware that pheasant hunters are sensitive about this species, and also northern goshawks for significant predation, they believe, and it's no doubt true, on ringneck pheasants. But I sure hope that hasn't translated into a legal persecution. Canada Jay numbers were very low on the 3 counts. Very cold weather always seems to reduce detection of this species, so I suppose, at least for Snake's Head and Cochrane Wildlife Reserve, we could attribute some of the low numbers on that. The other thing to notice on this portion of the species list is mountain chickadee numbers across the 3 counts illustrate the difference in the habitat and natural subregions that comprise each count. So you can see that at Sundre, up in Sundre, at Snake's Head, we're happy to get a mountain chickadee on the count. Cochrane Wildlife Reserve gets reasonable numbers, and the highest counts are in Sheep River, closer to the mountains. Finch numbers on these counts were low. I would say, although common redpolls and snow buntings were around in reasonable numbers, I guess, but not in the kind of numbers we've seen in some years. The gray crowned rosy finches that we found at Snake's Head was a nice find. So I'll get into so that's the species data. So I've just got a very few graphs that I think illustrate a few things. I'll skip through this. I've already made a comment about great horned owls and the fact that their numbers have gone down. This is the number per party hour of great horned owls at Snake's Head. You can see how that's gone down over time on the count. This is the Sheep River count. You can see how the numbers have gone down. In this case, it's the number of birds. If I present a graph that shows the number of birds rather than the number of birds per party hour, it's because the number of birds graph basically evidences the same thing that the number per party hour does. If there's a difference in what the two presentations show, then I'll show the number per party hour. Pygmy owls, which were hard to find this year. You can see at Snake's Head, we struck out there the last 3 years. So we haven't found any pygmy owls the last 3 years up in the Sundre area. At the wildlife reserve, there were no pygmy owls, and that was the first time that a pygmy owl hasn't been found since 1998. And in Sheep River, for the first time ever, we didn't find any pygmy owls. There were pygmy owl in count week, but we didn't find any on count day. The golden crowned kinglet is one that it's just, I really just noticed something about it this year. I'm interested in what people think, but if you look at this curve, there's something going on, you know, something's happened since about 2008 with the number of kinglets. And so this is the Sheep River count. So you can see that on this curve. And if we look at the Cochrane Wildlife Reserve count, it's not so pronounced, but again, the numbers of kinglets is lower than it had been since around 2008. And sorry, if we look at Snake's Head, I think it's also there again. Again, maybe not quite as clear as at Sheep River, but not. So I don't know what that means and why we're seeing lower numbers or finding lower numbers of golden crowned kinglet, but perhaps it's a species we need to keep an eye on. This is northern hawk owls. I know people are really interested in owls, so when we get an owl on one of the counts, particularly a rarer owl, I like to show the historical results for that species. So this is northern hawk owl. So you can see that the one we found this year was the first one since about 2017. A couple of years there, we had good counts of hawk owls. And the short-eared owl, you can see it's the first short-eared owl we've had since 2006. And historically, we did have some nice counts of short-eared owls on the Snake's Head CVC. Great crowned rosy finch, we got 6 at Snake's Head, as I highlighted in the numbers results. And interestingly enough, the only other record we have for that count, for the Snake's Head count, is back in 1998, and again, it was 6. Mountain chickadees, some of the other compilers mentioned things about mountain chickadees, and so I thought, not knowing that, but having noticed what's happening in these 3 counts with mountain chickadees, I thought it was worthwhile to show these curves. I think I've shown them in previous years, but you can see that so here we are at Cochrane Wildlife Reserve. So since about 1998, the numbers of mountain chickadees that we found has gone up significantly. I can remember way back when we were, you know, excited to think that we might get a mountain chickadee on this count, but now it's the numbers are reasonably high. So there's Cochrane Wildlife Reserve. Here's Sheep River. So if we go back, that was about 1998 or so. And again, somewhere in here, the mountain chickadees started to take off at Sheep River. So I don't, it's kind of interesting to think about them in the sense that that we would expect, I think, or let me put it a different way. I would suggest maybe that there must be factors other than climate change. Of course, we're always thinking climate change when we see changes in, in range and species numbers and so on. And I think something other than climate change must be at work here, because I think if we thought in climate change terms, we would think that mountain chickadee range would contract, not expand, and it seems to be expanding in these counts. And as I mentioned, some of the other compilers mentioned that mountain chickadee numbers were up a bit. So not sure what's going on there. Certainly there's feeding going on and contributing, but anyway, it's another thing to think about, and we'll have to keep an eye on what's going on here. Now, as everybody who's seen my presentations over the last number of years knows, I like to pull out of the Audubon compilations the counts from 2020. That's important to keep in mind. These, of course, aren't these year's counts, aren't this year's counts, because the counts haven't been compiled yet. So this is last year, 2020, and I like to pull out the Alberta counts that are either Canadian or North American highs, not all-time highs, but just for last year, for 2020. So the entries here that are highlighted in yellow are ones that are North American highs, and the others are Canadian highs. The non-highlighted ones are Canadian highs. A couple of notes. Interesting that Swainson's thrush was 1 in Calgary last year, was the North American high. Of course, it's a neotropical migrant. They go to South America to winter, so we wouldn't expect to see many in Canada or the U.S. But interesting that one makes the USA high. I think there was one seen at another site in the U.S. So Calgary wasn't alone with that high, but it was tied for it. And again, brown thrasher illustrates how it doesn't take very many of those to be a Canadian high. That bird doesn't go so far south, so there were some good counts in the U.S. That of course left us behind. I'll just leave my comments of that chart to that. Hopefully folks have seen what they need to see there. And I'd like to talk about the 4 species that our foothills counts are sort of infamous for. And one of them is the American three-toed woodpecker. I like to update everybody every year on this. So in the last 35 years, these 3 counts have had the highest North American count 19 times, 54% of those counts. 6 of them were at Cochrane Wildlife Reserve, 5 at Snake's Head, and Sheep River 8. So distributed fairly evenly across the 3 counts. Sheep River had a count of 11 this year. I think those were all from Brown Lowry. And that has a good chance of being the North America high. And that would be the 9th time that Sheep River would claim that title if it does. Canada Jay, for 37 years from 1984 until now, Cochrane Wildlife Reserve and Sheep River have had the highest North American counts for Canada Jay, 21 times, or 59% of those 37 years. And primarily that's in the Cochrane Wildlife Reserve, but Sheep River's claimed that title 7 times. Counts were very low this year, as I highlighted when we went through the species data. So I don't think any of our foothills counts will be the high count for 2021. Looking back over then the counts that were the highest, it looks like you need in excess of 70 to have a chance to be the highest. Great gray owl, in the last 42 years, Cochrane Wildlife Reserve and the Snake's Head, for some reason Sheep River doesn't compete for this. The Cochrane Wildlife Reserve and the Snake's Head have had the highest North American count 22 times, or about half the time. Primarily, again, Cochrane Wildlife Reserve with 16 and Snake's Head with 7. Sorry, that last statement is wrong. That's from last year. Cochrane Wildlife Reserve had 1 great gray owl this year, so it's unlikely that any of our counts this year will claim that title. Cochrane Wildlife Reserve had 15 last year, so I don't imagine any other count came anywhere near that. And then the last species I like to highlight, I can't see it's Boreal Chickadee. Anyway, I can't see the title. I hope you folks can. Anyway, this is Boreal Chickadee. So in the last 38 years, these 3 foothills counts have had the highest North American count about 1/3 of the time. Cochrane Wildlife Reserve 6 years, Snake's Head 6, Sheep River 1. We haven't had it for quite a few years because there's been a couple of Alaskan counts that have gotten into the picture, and they apparently have really nice populations of Boreal Chickadee, that being Fairbanks and Anchorage. However, in 2018, a count at Two Harbors, Minnesota, snatched it away from them for just the one year with a count of 535. Okay, I think I'll end my presentation there. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I suspect we'll go on to Calgary.
Hi, Doug. Just a quick question for you. I've seen party hour talked about quite a bit. I'm not familiar with that term. What does that mean?
Party hours, well, if you've participated in a count, the compiler would have asked you to keep track of the hours that you spent counting. So as a very rough way to standardize the numbers from year to year, it's been accepted that the best way to normalize the counts between years is to divide them by the party hours. So if there are a lot of participants one year and there's lots of party hours, then you might expect the numbers of a particular species to be higher. And in another year, if there was lower participation, you might expect the numbers to be lower. And so if we divide those numbers by the number of hours of effort, party hours being the amount of effort, then we can compare the numbers a little more readily than we can just using the absolute numbers. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. Anything else?
Okay, Doug, there was another question for you.
Okay.
Maybe not a question, but a hypothesis. Is it possible that the spike in mountain chickadees in 2018 could have to do with the fires over the border in BC that summer? So I think that's suggesting perhaps the population count, but maybe the range expansion that you've identified there.
Yeah, let me go back to that. So in 2018, yeah, this number here, 18, 19, 20, 21. I don't know. Perhaps, you know, there's been a lot of fires in BC over the last number of years, so I don't know. Again, I would think that mountain chickadees are adapted to higher elevations and the habitats that are associated with those higher elevations. So wouldn't have expected them to be expanding their range to lower elevations and the associated habitats with that lower elevation. So I don't know, perhaps. You know, I'm sorry, I
Might
can't
be-
provide any insight.